Here's my game of the day from round 2 of the Sinquefield Cup, and it's Magnus Carlsen against Sergei Karjakin. The two did battle in the World Championship match in 2016, and Karjakin is always a tough opponent for Carlsen. This was the position they reached after 32 moves, and it's very tight. You can see that it's a pretty blocked, closed position, an end game. Opposite coloured bishops. This is a superb piece of Carlsen's. Controlling those central squares, defending the pawn on b2. But how does white make progress here? You can see these double rooks are keeping white tied down to the pawn on e2, and that bishop does a very good job of holding the pawn here. My first thought with white in this position would be to play pawn to e3, and in that way to free the rook. And then, for example, I want to come around here to g1, open up the king side. That at first glance looked pretty good to me, but in fact black does have counterplay here. Rook over, and then the next rook over, and suddenly this sacrifice here on b2 could be very good for black. Hassling the king, and suddenly you've got a dangerous passed pawn. So it's not so easy for white to shift that rook over to the king side. So Carlsen played here bishop c3. I should say that both players, though, weren't exactly in time pressure at this moment. They had around about 10 minutes left for the remaining 7 moves, but still getting a little bit close to the edge. Now, Karjakin can only wait in this position. He was just shuffling the king back and forth on these squares. Carlsen decides to break with g4. And Karjakin is still shuffling with the king, and now rook f5 from Carlsen. So he's creeping forward. It's his kind of position. Notice there's nothing really that black can attack here. No real weaknesses in white's position apart from that pawn on e2, which ties the white rook down. Now, a couple of ideas that Carlsen has. Well, first there's the game idea. We'll see that in a second. And the other, of course, is to push forward with g5 at some moment. If king g6, then the rook can come across to h5, preventing a rook coming here, and that's a little bit annoying for black's king. Now Karjakin played rook b7. That means the rook is free to move, but again, if rook d1, then I think rook b8 with a possible sacrifice on b2 could be irritating. Carlsen here, he didn't think for too long. He sacrificed the exchange on d5. Fascinating decision. And this gives him a classic Carlsen position, actually, where he has a bishop and a pawn for a rook. So a very slight material disadvantage, but in fact, really only white has winning chances in this position if he plays correctly. We'll talk about the strategy and the in this position in a moment, but what I find interesting is that Magnus only thought for about 3 minutes before making this fundamental decision to sacrifice the exchange. He makes big decisions very quickly, quite typical of him, and that puts all the pressure on his opponent. When the nature of the position changes, his opponent has to readjust his whole mindset in this position. So why is this such a strong sacrifice? Well, it's this thing I mentioned earlier, that black doesn't have anything to hit. You can see that bishop is beautifully placed, supported by a pawn, in turn supporting the pawn on b2, and on the king side everything beautifully protected, and that rook is free to roam. Major pieces, the rooks in this case, need targets to attack, and there's nothing they can attack. That's the problem. Whereas here, well, there are 2 weak pawns, 2 isolated pawns, and also the possibility to advance this kingside pawn majority. Now, Karjakin here makes an extraordinary decision. He gives up the c-pawn. Now, he could have just protected this c-pawn with rook c7. Now, maybe he just didn't want to fall into a passive position. And white has the possibility, as I said, to expand on the king side. But still, it seems sensible to keep that pawn. But instead, Karjakin just ditched the c-pawn. He wanted to activate his rook. But I find this a strange decision because really this rook can't achieve too much because everything is beautifully protected. And well, many of you who are regular viewers to my channel and hear my commentary as well, you know that I have a thing about split rooks. Rooks don't work well together when they're apart. And I think this is a good case in point, actually. They simply can't achieve very much together, whereas if they're together, maybe on the 6th rank or doubled on the e-file, then they have the possibility to protect each other and always, for example, offer an exchange of rooks. That's something that generally would be desirable in this kind of position, simplifying down for black, exchanging off that powerful rook. It's certainly desirable for black. So, quick slurp of water. Rook c7. Carlsen is just keeping control for the moment. So making sure that king doesn't go too far, just positioning his rook on a nice square. Now, again, got to make progress. I should say that in the meantime, while Carlsen was still moving pretty steadily, Karjakin was having to invest time here thinking, well, how is Carlsen going to make progress? So much more difficult for the defender in this kind of position, of course, and that's typical for these kind of Carlsen endgames. He puts all the pressure on his opponent. He starts to make a little bit of progress here. The question you have to ask yourself in this kind of position, if you're playing with white, is not how do I win? That's the wrong question to ask yourself. The question, the right question is, how do I make progress? And this is progress. So what Carlsen is doing is just putting that pawn on a5, and that is just a slight improvement to his position. So everything is still protected, that bishop just performing wonders here. That pawn has just advanced closer to the queening square. That's what it's all about. So that later on, if that pawn ever drops, yeah, it's more dangerous for black. And sometimes, again, much later on in the game, it introduces the possibility of playing b5, and that a pawn is close to the queening square. So, and also fixes this pawn on a6. So this rook, black's rook, comes back into the game. Rook a7. Of course, white always has to be aware that black will sacrifice back and reach some kind of drawn rook and pawn endgame, but with the rook actively placed here, looking at the a pawn, then of course that's out of the question for black. And now white begins finally the advance on the king side. It's also notable that Carlsen delayed a long time, or just made sure everything was right before he commenced this kingside pawn majority advance. Pawns can't move backwards, so it's important to get it right and only then advance. So he makes sure that his pieces are in exactly the right position, and these are little improvements to his position before advancing. And there's no harm in letting your opponent stew in his own juice as well. f4. Now, involved a little bit of calculation. You have to make sure that this exchange sack, the sack back, isn't going anywhere. And in this case, because white's rook is so beautifully placed on the 7th rank, this is winning for white actually. e5, you can just power on straight through with your kingside pawns. And the rook is perfectly placed here. And then the king is going to come to g5, possibly pawn to g5, but probably king g5 and then a check. And you can see that, well, there's a terrible attack against black's king. Let's go back here. So f4 just played by Carlsen. Black offers an exchange of rooks. And, well, the king shouldn't come forward here. That would be suboptimal because of checkmate. So the king has to fall back. Now, this is a highly unpleasant position for Karjakin to defend. However, objectively, he's still fine here. He just has to keep his nerve. But as we know, these kind of endgames, very, very difficult to do that. But so far, he's actually, I think after this rook tour, Karjakin has found his feet again, actually. That's the only point that the rooks can attack. And so this is correct strategy from Karjakin. Keeps white tied down for the moment. So Carlsen has to think again about how he's going to make progress. And having got so far on the king side, he now turns his attention to the other side of the board. Carlsen could have pressed on with e5, but he didn't want to get into the complications of rook d3. Instead, he keeps it simple. Bishop d4. And we can see his idea behind this now. He's advancing his queenside pawn. So this introduces potentially the threat of playing b5 to create a passed a pawn, but also gives his bishop squares to sit on here. When this b pawn advances, of course, in this transitional phase, you could say, the bishop has lost its support on c3, so Carlsen has to make sure that that bishop will sit solidly on either b6 or c5. Very important that that bishop is well supported. Now, the black king better watch out again. Yeah, another little checkmating position. If rook d8, hitting the bishop, we can give a check. And here it's going to be mate on h5. It's a pity for black's king. It has to fall back here. So always very difficult when you can't really activate your king very well. So now the bishop comes to this wonderful square on c5. Was on c3, now on c5, keeping everything beautifully protected. That's, I think, the big lesson for this endgame. Keeping everything rock solid. And now Carlsen is getting ready for the next stage, which is to advance with either e5 or g5. Here's an interesting moment, because here black could force an exchange of rooks. Now, they've passed the second time control, but and now Karjakin was basically running right down to the wire. They're playing with a 30-second delay in this game. And Karjakin was getting close to that. And it's not in, of course, it's very difficult to calculate under such circumstances. But of course, he would have been looking at this move rook d1, which basically more or less forces an exchange of rooks. But I think he would have been very wary of these kind of variations. What white needs to do is to try and force a way through for the king over here. So, for example, in these kind of positions with black's king way out across the other side of the board, then this position is just going to be winning for white. The king comes to b7 and it's really over. In fact, black can probably still hold with this, but this is very tricky. I mean, these are long and complicated variations, but black, playing precisely, can actually hold this position. Rook b1 is a very exact move, but there's no way you can calculate this when you're short of time. And this should be a draw. But yeah, forcing variations, very, very difficult to calculate. And in fact, Karjakin plays pragmatically with rook e8, and it's a good move. And he finds an excellent defense here, g5. So he's just keeping white tied down to his only weakness here. And here's a very impressive moment. I think, Carlsen took here on g6 en passant. He could drop back to e3. You know, if I were playing this game, I would kind of agonize for a long time. What gives me the best winning chances? Should I come back to e3, maybe try to attack the f6 pawn? But no, Carlsen very quickly took on g6, and I think this is typical Carlsen again, that he makes big decisions very quickly, and that puts all the pressure on his opponent. And I think this exchange, although in some ways, you know, this benefits black, exchanging off these pawns, but also it's the simplest for white to play as well, because he doesn't have to worry about protecting those kingside pawns. The position is opened up so that perhaps he can hassle the king as well. But obviously exchanging those pawns brings black closer to a draw. Karjakin has played excellently, actually, to this point. I think giving up that pawn was perhaps a slightly dubious position, but he found his feet again, and he's done pretty well. He's held his nerve up until this moment. So he's running short of time. This is very difficult. And here, I think he makes an understandable decision to bring his king up the board. You know, it must have offended him that he had to play so passively with his king for the entire game, and suddenly he sees a chance to come up the board and protect the a-pawn, but it's a mistake. He should just keep checking like this. And it's difficult for white's king to find shelter here. Coming back to this position, perhaps Carlsen could try something like bishop d4 to block the check, keep the king in active position. But rook d8 is a very uncomfortable move to face. I think that would have been Karjakin's best chance. Well, in any case, king c6 is a clear mistake. He cracks right at the end. And here, Carlsen is able to drive the king to a poor position, and the a-pawn is under fire. The rook is able to support the e-pawn here, and this king, I'm afraid, can't stop white's pawns. It's just out of play now. Look how important that bishop is, controlling key squares here, preventing the king being hassled. And you can see in a moment it also has a bearing at the other end of the board as well. So here, after the check, the king comes to g7, and actually the king is safe on this square because the bishop controls g1, preventing black's rook from checking there. And now there's nothing that can prevent white moving forward again. Threat, rook takes pawn, and also white is able to advance again, and that bishop just keeps everything protected, everything under control. Now it's very simple. Threat, rook d8. And here, after rook takes pawn, Karjakin resigned. That really is too much. Let me just show you what might be a typical finish. So let's pose that black waits, then rook f6, and that makes way for the a-pawn. And for example, and a check, and rook b8. I mean, there are many ways to win, and many ways to defend as well, but ultimately they're all going to be hopeless. Well, that was, I think, a fantastic performance by Carlsen, and he said after the game that he felt that he was back to, playing his kind of chess. So that brings him to 1.5 out of 2. We've seen Carlsen start very well in tournaments recently. In Biel, just a couple of weeks ago, he started excellently. But this kind of game takes so much energy. This was 88 moves. 88 moves. It's really tough. He also started very well in the Grenka as well, and Norway too, if my memory serves me correctly. But as I said, it takes so much energy. The question is, can he keep this going for the rest of the tournament? Well, do join me for more round reports. If you want to see the first round game of the day, then do click on the info tab and you'll see the link there. And remember, if you want to subscribe, it's free to subscribe to the channel. Do just click on the subscription button and click on the bell for instant notifications as well when I post new videos. And thank you to all the new patrons who support the channel, and the existing ones as well. They help to keep the lights on here. We couldn't do it without you, so thank you very much to you. And if you want to support the channel, do check out patreon.com/PowerPlayChess, and again, you'll find the link up there. And enjoy the rewards, extra videos and other kinds of things as well. Thanks very much for watching.